Hi everyone, and welcome to the second, parallel session of the Australian Media Traditions Conference. And I'm very pleased to have you here today for this paper to be presented by Ashley Jones from the University of Southern Queensland. So just before we start, I just want to acknowledge that I'm joining the conference today from Cadigal and Bidjigal land in Sydney, and also to acknowledge that I also work on the lands of the Darug Nation, and particularly the Wadawurrung clan of Macquarie University. And I would like to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and extend my respects to any Indigenous First Nations people joining us here today. So I'm going to hand over to Ashley for the paper. The paper's title is The Role of Radio in Our Australian Rural and Regional Places, a Queensland Study. Ashley is, as I mentioned, from the University of Southern Queensland, is extremely passionate about local media and particularly the place that broadcast media has in our society, but also other distribution platforms. Particularly having a research interest in the history of radio and television in Australia and the role that media plays in community development. And Ashley, we've just been hearing, is actively involved in the local media industry in Toowoomba and has been lecturing in broadcast, online and radio television, and particularly producing content through resources at University of Southern Queensland, the Springfield campus. And we've just been hearing about 4DB and also a radio group in regional Southern Queensland. So lots to hear about from Ashley's experience. I'm really looking forward to this paper.
Thank you very much. And it's wonderful to be here. Last opportunity we had to be together back in the old days, we used to meet face to face, was over in Adelaide. So it was wonderful to be part of the conference face to face, and good to be able to come and share in this way. So I thought it would be good to maybe just kick this off by thinking about where have we come from, and I think that's always important to understand the roots. And so for us, the hallmark of early radio across Australia and certainly in Queensland was firstly about the local ownership, and so stations were owned by usually local consortiums, and so there were some 7 commercial radio stations across Queensland in that regional rural setting. They would then draw on local advertisers and were those who would offer local news services and be actively engaged in critical moments. So floods, droughts, fires, whatever it may have been, they were actively involved, but also intrinsically linked into the community. And so part of that was also that they were highly visible in the community, supporting events, sponsoring events, providing that conduit for the community to be able to share its story and to provide that kind of infrastructure within the community. And so in a way, kind of as a summary, it's really to say, well, there's a focus on serving the community. And in today's world, that can sound a little hokey, but the reality is that's where these stations have come from. And I don't know that I think we've really moved too far beyond that, and that's some of what I'll be discussing. Now, in terms of helping to pick this up, and Michael, in the last presentation that I was privileged to be part of, looking at local television, was also using the language around localism, and I'm a great advocate and would love to catch up with you, Michael, a bit more to talk about this. But I think there's a very definite space for us to start to really own that language around media localism. I would suggest and argue that it's a way to help us unpack and perhaps to interrogate more of that work that's happening within the local media space. And as a way of understanding that, looking at local as a place. So again, whilst that is understood in these terms as a geographically defined place, media localism isn't restricted to only understanding, I don't think, local as that geographically defined place, because if we think about local as place, it is certainly something that we would see as very highly subjective. It's very contextual and so on. So I think to only consider it in that particular light would limit the opportunities. But it is important, however, to recognise the value of place. I think that's possibly where some of the global conversation has in many ways devalued place or the role of place. And so I think it is something to continue to work with and to flesh out. Local as practice is in many ways some of the things that I was talking about, that idea that we would, in that way, kind of continue to rehearse and identify and understand what it is to be local. The geographically located place, as I've said, is important for us to consider. And then certainly to recognise that perhaps another language that might be more useful is local as that community. And we'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. But I think we'd all agree that local becomes a very slippery term, and many academics have grappled with that whole sort of terminology in that framework. But what I think makes it less slippery, if I can use that term, is when we start talking about it in media localism terms. And it helps, in my mind, to really help focus our interest in understanding what is happening in the market, and particularly in rural regional locations, because there is an assumption that commercial radio, which is the dominant source there for us, holds a place of influence. And that's certainly been recognised by government and by the community at large. But I think this is something that we need to really work with and support. I also want just to acknowledge that the theoretical underpinning for my focus is that Bourdieuian approach, and looking at the practice and specifically the field of radio. So how we might think about how radio operates, and looking at the power plays in those positions within the field, and who is in the game and who's out of the game. And I think that lovely language that Bourdieu offers for us, that fish in or out of water, becomes really important here, because where the audience, who I think also has been highly devalued, really then gets to be understood as a significant part of the conversation about the role of local media. Now, for some reason, that doesn't want to move. So here we are, we're on. Now, when we continue that thinking about media localism, I think, as I mentioned before, local gets weakened in the current conversations when we put it into a digital or online framework. But I don't think that in any way robs the real value of place. And I'm talking about local in terms of place. One of the kind of key authors around media localism, Christopher Ali, argues that rather than place, perhaps a way of thinking about it is local in terms of community. And I would certainly agree with Ali. I think there is something about that language that helps us to not get caught up in the conversation about local, but to look at community, and community in the sense is a community is what we make of it. And it often is then located in place. It is in those areas of interest, whether that's within a religious framework or whatever that kind of community will be, sporting, family, all those very key communities of interest. It's language that we have become very comfortable with and more familiar with. And I don't think it necessarily then starts to become as problematic as that notion of local. And it's the idea of community is the quality of holding something in common, I think is really where this comes to the core. So if we really want to give media localism some kind of definition, it is based on that understanding or the belief that broadcasters should be responsive to the local geographically defined community to which they're licensed. And that is really going to the heart of the challenges we have. In my research over the last several years, one of the key areas, particularly coming off the back of my PhD, was to really flesh out for myself, what is this media localism? What does it all look like as a way to measure? And that's really my next part of my academic journey, is now to really bed this down as a tool that will help us to look at what is happening in any individual community. So I go back to that earlier point. There's a context that we need to be mindful of. So within that context, the findings out of that research was to identify that within that local geographically defined place, the radio service, and I'm talking now specifically about radio, is that there was a high level, a high measure of familiarity. What that means is that the things that are discussed on air, in advertising, in program content, announces, the language that was used, the content that's on air, continues to support the idea that this is familiar to me, that this place belongs, this radio station, sorry, belongs to this place, and this place belongs to the radio station. And it becomes a significant marker, and I'll talk about that in a moment. The idea of security, or I'd flesh that out to be about the well-being, again, because of that kind of communication that's going on, means that, yeah, this station understands me. It reflects my values. It reflects my beliefs about this community. It lets me know that I'm safe and secure within this community and in my engagement with this radio service. Another important element was about the liveness, the fact that there are what I call warm bodies in the studio, that it isn't remoted in content, and that liveness, often reduced to a very throwaway line of live and local at stations right across Australia, if not indeed across the world, love to hook into. But it has to have a reality about it, and it has to be real people, which flows back up into familiarity and flows into security. So all of these things can never be separate to each other, but are intrinsically linked. And the ownership also becomes important, and important in the sense that I don't get any sense out of the findings that it has to be someone necessarily based in that community, but whoever owns the station really needs to understand the community, and there needs to be an absolute awareness of the context of that community. Now, what the findings showed was that these attributes, if present, identified a very healthy radio service, and healthy meaning that it was one that the community would support. What the findings identified was that, and it was interesting, in an ethnographic approach that I took to this, and doing a whole range of focus groups, the body language that changed from talking about, and specifically in my PhD, I did it on 4IP, which was a very strong local radio service within the city of Ipswich. It covered Brisbane, the Gold Coast, and Sunshine Coast unofficially. When people were talking about that station, they would lean forward, they would become very animated, incredibly engaged, talking around all the fondness of those indicators that I've talked about. But when I talked about the newer offering in the town, they would sit back, completely disengaged. And not only was it in the physical signs of what was going on there, but it was also the language. It was our radio station, but now they do this and they do that. And so there was a real sense of disconnection. And so that idea of being very connected to, and that suggests to me that inextricable linking, that I call it like a fibre, where the radio service is woven into the fabric of the community and the community is woven into the station. It's at that level of the trust that occurs that people know it will be there. But when it isn't there, then that's when we identify that the service is either highly relevant or the service becomes incredibly irrelevant to the audience. And as I mentioned before, the whole notion of understanding audience and respecting them in the industry today, in television, and perhaps to a lesser degree in radio, but we do talk about the audience now as the punter, as if in some way it's all a gamble, rather than that these are people who have made a choice to engage with this particular service, and that language really bothers me. Really quickly, of course, we're very aware of the current trends. We have the networked ownership. We have, in many cases, a very clear disconnection from the community on the basis of the media localism markers that I'm talking about. What they offer up is the meeting of the requirements to keep the license, but it isn't necessarily about supporting your audience. Because people listen to a radio station doesn't mean they like it. And there's a really significant difference. I've seen many surveys that large organisations, network radio services, they'll start their survey at a premise of, we're fantastic, how do we become more fantastic? As opposed to a more honest survey that would be more about, how well are we doing? Are we meeting your needs? And that's part of something I'll just show you in a moment. But certainly in the current models, in a lot of cases, there's no local presence at all. There's just simply a building. And there's also, because of that, a loss of the local voice. It doesn't have to be that way, but there are choices that are being made that are not helpful to the local community. I would argue that local is important. There's downtown Cunnamulla, and these communities so heavily rely on these services that are offered from the ABC, from commercial players, and indeed in community radio, and all of them play a significant role. So the Western Queensland research that I specifically then carried out was to go into 4ZR Roma, which was the incumbent, if I can put it in those terms, within that community, and has since been kind of lost to a whole range of other stations. In Charleville, 4VL, and both these stations, and my first radio station as a commercial announcer was at 4ZR when I was slightly younger, and then out to 4LG. And these stations were all very significant stations in their community based on what I said before in terms of that level of connection. The ownership, the management was strong, it was local in each and every one of those cases, but there was a loose kind of network that occurred within that space, and that became really important. But in the research, you know, we hear, of course, radio is always dying. I think it's been dying since about the 1935, early 30s through to the 1940s, really. And then, of course, television came in the 50s, and radio was going to die. And it's reinvented itself, and it continues to be an incredibly robust industry. 84% of the respondents in those markets that I've outlined there listen to radio on a regular basis, weekly basis. The reasons they listen to it is the music, is the local content, and for news and local news service. But does the local radio meet their needs? This is where it became very interesting that 16% of the surveyed became immediately very neutral around this. 18% only agreed. I can't just recall the exact number, but I think it was something about 3% who strongly agreed, but 10% strongly disagreed with the fact that it meets the needs. This is just some early baseline data. I was just seeking to start to understand a bit more about what's going on in these markets. I want to go back out and do a fuller, deeper research process. But in what ways does local radio meet my needs? Local information, local stories, would like more local content. And this became the interesting stuff. It became hopeful comments. It wasn't that it is doing this now. In what ways does local radio meet my needs? Respondents in most cases started to use language that suggested that this was more about my hope for what it will do rather than what it's currently doing. But in some cases it was doing it. It keeps me informed on local happenings. I enjoy the local presenters. We know through COVID that that has become a really significant part of broadcast, and particularly in radio, that people are not only listening to a radio station for all of the latest news and information, but they do so because they have a great trust, a connection with that particular announcer. Then we see how many people feel, that they see it as an absolute disgrace to how it's degenerated, more and more, different sort of content that doesn't meet their needs. And this is just a sample of what was a fairly typical kind of range of comments. And I think we're probably just about running out of time. 2 minutes, roughly speaking. When I were able to follow up with some focus groups in those communities, what was really interesting was around the idea that people were feeling very disconnected from the local radio station. They didn't recognise that there were other players in the field. They still harken back to the foundational radio station, like 4ZR, that's been there for 80 years under different ownership structures, certainly, but that longevity certainly gave it a privileged place in the field. But when they look to it to be certain things for the community, it's failing. And that becomes a very problematic and recurring theme across these different markets. I wanted to ask the question of, because it was very clear about the Facebook groups that are going on in these markets. And again, this is not this or that. I have absolutely no concerns about this and that. It's just that one radio is not performing like it should be, in my view. But it was very interesting and very telling that, currently it's around 34% of people who will use social media, predominantly Facebook, to get their message out in these communities as an average. But if social media wasn't the place to turn to, what would you turn to? And then it turns strongly around to radio. There sits underneath this conversation an expectation that radio will meet my needs. There was a level of frustration that it has been turned into a completely commercial entity. We're not talking about, obviously, specifically commercial radio, but they were aware of those days when you could get community announcements on air, but there are not those windows to be able to provide that kind of space. And that was a point of sadness. You could see the language that changed, the physical natures to that. Just as a quick grab from Extra Insights, you can see on that chart the number of stations that are in, and I did want to acknowledge that the ABC has the limitations geographically because they have southern Queensland based in Toowoomba, but it serves right through out into Roma, out into Charleville, so it's hundreds of kilometres distance that it's covering, and that goes right up into Kingaroy. And then ABC Western Queensland coming out of Longreach travels down. So again, it's hundreds of kilometres of distance. And people like the ABC have a major challenge because they have their central studio location and hundreds of kilometres to travel to be able to get out to do a lot of stories. They do as good a job as I believe they can do with the limitations, but that's just the kind of structure that's going on in just one community. Go back 20 years and it was 4ZR and a community radio station. And this is just another kind of just confirmation around what I mentioned earlier around the content. And then just really quickly, Justine, if that's all right, just to quickly summarise this. I think that some of certainly the things that not only about key findings, but also things that I am now seeing as the next steps for work is about helping us to recognise the role of radio is about service to the people and how that message can be communicated to the owners, remembering that there's one single owner, Resonate, that owns the 7 commercial stations throughout Western Queensland. So they are responsive and have a level of awareness of the challenges that they're before them. But I think, again, I can see that things like the language of media localism will really give them something that they can get hold of as a way forward. Probably importantly, to look beyond what is the government legislation and requirements, but to look at what is it that the community is asking for. And I think that was picked up this morning in the keynote around the idea of the community voice that is not only lacking on air, but it's lacking in informing what the people want. So there's this assumption that our voted members of parliament will be able to tell us when they simply aren't asking the people. So I think, it's reminding the public that they have opportunities to in a way lobby and to have their needs put on the agenda. I think they see the media outlets as untouchable, and so these are kind of some things that I think are becoming more and more important. I think, and when I was at 4VL, that's what I had, was a door locked, not a person to be seen. It's remoted in from Kingaroy. I guess we can be grateful it's still on air, but it's not meeting the needs. And doing a specific community engagement body of work in Charleville, it was very clear that there's a high level of frustration. And if these things don't change, this is about community well-being and that sense of democracy that flows from all of this. So I think there's about being able to think about redefining business models. I am working to look at how we might be able to do some integration between students who are able to get out into that market in their final year and find some kind of relationship between a student and a radio station in those markets. Thinking about reimagining what these places could look like, maybe a partnership between a local employment agency, the radio station, and indeed us as a university to look at what would training incentives look like, so that there's something of that essence of community radio that may well find itself within these stations. And the question why? Because if you are disconnected from the community, advertisers don't really want to know about you. The community doesn't really own you. And so you're just another service in the town. And so all of this really does matter. And it's, as you always know, in all these things, there's a massive body of story sitting behind this, but I'll end there. And thanks so much for listening.
Thanks so much, Ashley. Such amazing research and so many layers to that we can explore. We only have a few minutes, and I know in the Zoom conference world you don't really have time to go off and have coffee and venue to do that and chat afterwards. So what I might say is we'll take questions now, but if people do need to leave because we're going to head up against the midday the news at midday, then
That's right, yes.
then we're going to you're very welcome to leave and drop off the call, but we'll definitely stay here for a few minutes to ask some questions of Ashley. It's such an interesting paper and raising so many interesting ideas and concepts. So I'll hand over to the audience now. Would anyone like to ask a question of Ashley?
It's not so much a question as a comment. Ashley, I really enjoyed, I guess, the approach that you've taken here by thinking very carefully about what the community is actually asking for in the way, I guess, that then you've thought about how, some of the challenges that these media outlets are facing. And I guess one question I could ask is about, what in this current context where it's almost like the term regional and the term local, like they're collapsing into one if they haven't already. And that's, of course, different in different areas of Australia. Have you got any thoughts on that, especially, kind of your last slide there where you're talking about the real significance of what local means?
Yeah, well, I think probably where that regional comes into, Deb, is because I'm based around Ipswich area, we will be called regional when it suits government for funding. And then all of a sudden we're metropolitan when it also suits them for funding. And I think that probably goes to the heart of this, that I don't know that there's actually a genuine investment into really giving clear definition around this. And I think that's where this would start, is to really provide some very clear definitions around what are the political influences in the actual name of regional. What does it mean? Because there's some imperatives around that in terms of health service, policing, education. And so I think that's probably where it needs to start, is to not continue just to say all these terms are slippery, but let's actually have that conversation to come to an agreement about what does this mean with all stakeholders invested. And then I think we can then start to move on to having more meaningful conversations. But I think it's a very important point, Devon, and it's one that really needs to be fleshed out.
Thank you.
Yeah, look, thanks very much, Ashley, for a great talk. You said that licence conditions were being met, but there's still a problem. I mean, is there a strong case and a way of revising those licence conditions?
Well, because of the influence of many media owners into the government, it becomes very problematic. And what is, for me, very problematic is that it is local promotions. So if a station's involved in a local event, that gets ticked as local content. So a bit like what I just said about regional, it's incredibly slippery and doesn't really require these players to invest themselves into the community. My greater concern with this, Jennifer, is that I think there needs to be a growing awareness of the implications for them as business operators. So if that's the premise that they're coming from, even speaking to them at that level, looking at the bottom line, I think if they don't simply invest into providing more time, the advertisers will get thinner on the ground, because it's also about, just as a quick example, if I may, when I was out on one of these trips, I was in Emerald, and there's a radio station in there, 4HI, and the motel where I was staying, the lady started getting in conversation. She's heavily involved in the Chamber of Commerce. And I thought this was a really great example of what we're talking about in many ways, that she said, the advertising is too expensive. We're in the middle of a drought. We can't afford it. And I said to her, so has anyone from the station actually come to you with like maybe a drought busting package that says, you know, what, you know, maybe half price, and we'll give you the same amount of ads, but we'll bring it together and actually get a message of we're working together, and that implies shopping locally, etc. And she said, no, they never. And as I talked into the station management, they hadn't even thought of it. And I think, so what I've been sort of really encouraged with and discouraged at the same time has been that there's so many kind of taken for granted that sit within this. And part of that is this license requirement, is that I think we've got to get all the structures together right. We'd need to have local media owners willing to buy into supporting their community, the local voice, and then letting all of that rise up to government to say, here's what we think is a reasonable amount of local content. And by local content, we mean, and it should be more than local ads, local promos, and a bit of local weather that they throw in, coming from a regional centre, you know, where they hub it in. I think my argument would get very wobbly if I was to take a very militant view and so they must be completely all on the one premise and they must open the doors again and they must do this. There's an economic reality around this. So I'm coming more from the premise of saying I'd rather take a good, honest look at all of the circumstances that are in here, but keeping the healthy tension about what the community needs, what the audience is looking for, and then how we start to meet those needs. And I don't think that sort of approach has been taken on.
Thanks, Jennifer, for that question. Any other burning questions while we have a couple more minutes? I guess I had, following up from what Jennifer was just asking, Ashley, I had a question about that sort of typology you put up of what the audience actually wants, the sort of concepts around familiarity, belonging, security, well-being, liveness, actual people that they know, sort of very interesting because it kind of, it goes right to that sort of presence of radio, the co-presence kind of feeling that you have listening to radio, which you don't ever really have on Facebook or on social media. You don't have that simultaneity. But I was interested in how you put ownership down the bottom, and I was wondering if you thought these were sort of interrelated in any sort of way. Is it sort of that you could have them sort of the familiarity, security, and liveness are necessary, but the ownership is not necessary if the network model sort of worked to then have those first three qualities.
Yes. I agree with you. I think there's
a variable, or is it a dependent variable, I suppose?
Yes, yeah. I do think it is to a certain degree a bit of an outlier in there in that sense. But certainly not hierarchical, because there was a real strength in the response that was very clear across all of those. They became very clear, emerged themes from that research. And so I think in that way, they all had equal weighting. But I think my unpacking of that ownership stuff is more about notice us, really own us as an audience, recognize the community. So I think unpacking that, I think they are met in those top three areas. If they're followed through, then that ownership, it was really more a cry, I think, from people to say, if it's locally owned, at least they're more likely to behave themselves, is what I think it really boiled down to. So I think, the subsequent research will probably help us to maybe really unpack a bit more about that to give it even more clarity. So that's how I would respond to that.
Thanks. Any final questions? Or should we wrap up and let people go and have lunch? Really wonderful paper. Thank you so much. There's been a comment in the chat too. So thanks to everyone for great questions, and look forward to hearing more about all this research, Ashley, as well.
Thank you very much, Justine.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.